from Columbia in high definition. This is WIS News 10 Awareness.
Hello, welcome to Awareness. I'm Renee Carter. It's estimated that less than 3% of all of the engineers in the United States are minorities. On this week's show, we'll take a look at a program designed to help increase the number of minority engineers. JP will be talking with poet, playwright Annie Green Nelson, and we'll have more on awareness, so please stay with us.
Some local leaders will tell us what they are doing now to improve race relations. That's coming up on this edition.
Good morning and thank you for joining us for Awareness. I'm your host, Megan Norman. This year we're celebrating 45 years of awareness on WIS. In January of 1970, a new program was created to educate and engage the community with a specific focus around African American achievement and the advancement of race relations. Awareness has become one of the longest running shows in the country and quite possibly the longest running African American public affairs show. Awareness has had dozens of hosts spanning the nearly 5 decades. I recently had the chance to sit down with JP Neal Jr, the first host who stayed at the helm for 25 years. Let's go back to January 1970.
Correct.
When Awareness first came to be. How did the show get created and how did you get involved in it?
Isaac Washington, a graduate of Benedict College, had a celebrated job here as a cameraman. And the general manager, James Yeager, asked him and challenged him to try to address a public affairs, community-oriented program that would involve the black issues from a positive perspective. Mm-hmm. So Isaac and I met and we labored over an idea and how it would be. Other people were involved in being auditioned to have the position as host. I was finally selected, and we came up with an idea, Isaac Washington and I, to name the show Awareness.
And why the name Awareness?
Awareness is the highest level of consciousness. We want to raise the level of consciousness about America, about the South, and about America's contributions to African Americans' progress and African Americans' progress in general. Mm-hmm. So we did a lot of things directed in giving people information.
Right, informing people, helping them actively make their own decisions and conclusions.
Exactly, and becoming their own levels of consciousness.
Right. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the time period, 1970, a big transitional period. So what was the mission of Awareness in terms of helping people make that transition?
The owners of WIS Television, Cosmos, Liberty Life Corporation, dedicated themselves to making sure South Carolina would transition better than a lot of our sister and brother states were going through during the 70s when the civil rights movement was peaking. Mm-hmm. And it was also in vogue for the establishment to acknowledge the presence of African American or black contributions to the entire American scenario. So the mission of Awareness was to bring that to the forefront and to do it visually and to do it from an informational kind of spirit, mm-hmm. and to give people in the community a chance to identify with something of credence. WIS Television.
Right.
Awareness. Give them a sense of it's all right for integration to occur. Mm-hmm. It's all right for us to get along together.
Right. And these ideas, these topics of getting along together, it wasn't just for the African American community, but for everyone.
For the entire community.
Right.
we took the premise that if America ever becomes America, it might happen in the South first. And we want to be in the leadership of that. Right. And we had a good governor, Governor Robert E. McNair. We had a good mayor, Mayor Lester Bates. We had good ownership and good leadership at WIS Television and good leadership in this community. Columbia has been a very, I guess, favorable climate for people coming together to understand our differences and to not deal with the issues of protest, violence that were associated with the civil rights movement. It was all over the television and that kind of thing. Right. Now, it was also in vogue during the 70s, and perhaps a part of the issue from the FCC, that stations across the country needed and perhaps had to do something in order to keep their license. So the timing was correct. Right. The fullness of time, in other words.
Well, speaking of time, did you ever think that awareness would last as long as it has so far, 45 years and counting?
I am amazed and very grateful and thankful to God Almighty and all of the great people who have helped make awareness sustain itself from its very beginning. It was a lot of hard work. There were a lot of times we would have to come here and tape the show 3 o'clock in the morning because that was the only available time and a crew that could do it. But there was a strong commitment.
Dedication.
Strong dedication. And I'm so happy to see people like yourself, people like Craig Melvin, people like Jacquelyn Johnson, Renee Carter, Beryl Dakers, Jocelyn Tucker, Bill Chapman, and others. Did I mention Craig Melvin?
You did, all contributing to the legacy and keeping it going.
Right. And I never envisioned that it would last this long. And I was told just recently by a friend that this show perhaps is the longest running, continuously running, locally produced television show in South Carolina.
And you hosted it for 25 years.
25 years.
JP Neal Jr. and I are just getting started. Up next, part 2 of the interview, where he reflects on his most memorable guests and the future of awareness. But first, a clip from the past with JP and Carmelita Kirksey.
When we come back, local leaders will talk to us about how we can improve race relations in our Palmetto State.
And here's another trivia question and answer.
Good evening and welcome to Awareness. Awareness tonight will be brought to you from the first Black Cultural Arts Festival here in Columbia. And for those of you who missed it, we'll bring you the highlights.
Bill, the Young Leaders, I think the group is called, has given us visual arts, music, and much, much more. You have an interview with an outstanding legislator from New York, I believe.
Yes, Mr. Assemblyman Arthur O. Eve, so please stay tuned. We'll be right back.
That was JP Neal Jr. and Bill Chapman hosting Awareness from a cultural arts festival in Columbia believed to be in the late 70s. As we continue to celebrate the rich 45-year history, Neal recounts some of his interviews and most memorable guests. Do you remember your very first show?
Of course, of course. I'll never forget that very first show. Isaac Washington and I were able to get Muhammad Ali, who had come to town to speak against the Vietnam War. But we didn't want to talk to him about that. We wanted him to be on the show to talk about some of that, but primarily he had just been beaten by Joe Frazier, a native of South Carolina, Beaufort.
That was the topic.
Correct. Oh, yes. And Joe Frazier had just addressed the General Assembly and had been in town, and we were able to capture his address and interview Joe Frazier. And we saved that piece. So finally we were able to get Muhammad Ali, and we tied the two together. And then in addition to Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, the governor of the state and the General Assembly had invited an ambassador from either Nigeria or Liberia. His name was Ebenezer Deborah, I'm sorry. And there was a local physician's wife who had started a boutique, who was a fashion designer, and she opened a shop downtown in the Arcade Mall. That was the format of the show. And that show aired in January, around the 1st of January, if I'm not mistaken, in 1970.
Well, Muhammad Ali is still catching my attention. What was that first question you asked him?
I'll never forget his response. Being pompous, I said, Mr. Cassius Clay, Mr. Muhammad Ali, how does it feel to be in the Palmetto State after just having an experience with Joe Frazier, who just recently addressed the General Assembly and will be on this show? He looked to me as if he was suddenly had a shock. He said, "What? That gorilla?" And he walked off the set.
Wow.
We were outdoors in front of the old Sheraton Hotel, in front of the old basketball arena downtown.
So memorable. I know you have other memorable moments on the show, and we could spend days or weeks going over the past 25 years that you hosted.
One funny time we had was with James Brown. James Brown would come and ask to be on the show.
Oh, really?
He was doing a lot of things to stay in school, don't use drugs, and he was even working as an agent for the federal government. And he lived right over in the Augusta area.
Right.
So he would come to Columbia and then call and ask to be on the show. But there was one time he was on the show, and introducing him, I said, "Mr. Brown, you are soul brother #1 and a black entrepreneur." He said, "You call me a black what?" It was so funny. It was so animated. We've had other people on the show that I'm very proud to tell you about. Jane Kennedy, a native her parents are from South Carolina. We've had Mrs. Coretta Scott King.
Tonight, Mrs. King talks about the future of African Americans and civil rights.
If America has failed, it's because America failed to listen to Dr. King's pleas.
Oprah Winfrey's been on this show. Sammy Davis Jr. has been on this show. Hank Aaron has been on this show.
Wow.
We've had a lot of prominent African Americans and whites who have come to this town to visit, and we've been able to capture them and bring them by the studio.
Right.
Fortunately, I had a job that I could take off and go.
Right.
And do it. So we had a dedication to get it done.
Right. Well, let me ask you this. When you look back over the 45-year history and you look forward to the future, what do you want to see awareness become?
Better.
How so?
Better in terms of community support, community acceptance, and perhaps a better time frame. The time frame, Sunday morning at 10:30.
It's 11 now.
11 o'clock. Well, that's a disadvantageous time for some of the many people who may want to watch the show and see it. The content of the show, very good. Improvements can be made, I think, around issues, hard-hitting, counterpoint kind of interactions with the community, dealing with controversial issues in an intelligent, informative way, so people will not get all kinds of misled information.
Because the show is awareness, informing people, equipping them with the right information.
Correct. Now, the show has been on for 45 years, okay?
Right.
I would like to see the show continue as long as WIS is in broadcasting.
That sounds like a great goal. Looking forward. JP Neal Jr., thank you so much for being with us. Awareness has made a lot of strides in its history and continues to do so. Its legacy made possible by all of those who paved the way, including a few familiar faces who will be joining me after the break. There have been many hosts in the 45-year history of Awareness, including the women who join me now. Jacquelyn Johnson hosted in the 1970s with JP Neal Jr. She is now a producer at ETV. And Carolyn Sawyer, she owns her own communications company. She hosted Awareness and anchored here at WIS in the mid-80s and then again in the mid-90s. And of course, Judi Gatson, a current main anchor here at WIS who's been here for almost 20 years. Thank you, ladies, so much for being with me this morning.
Thank you for inviting us back. This is great.
Thank you very much.
I know it's been a while for some of us. Coming back to reflect on this incredibly rich history, Jacquelyn, I'll start with you. You co-hosted with JP Neal, who we just saw a few minutes ago. What was that experience like for you, producing and co-hosting?
I loved every minute of it. It meant meeting history makers on a weekly basis. And of course, I got a chance to not only be a news reporter and anchor during the week, but on the weekends, I would co-host with JP Neal, and we'd do the Awareness Show. And my friends and family, we looked forward to that Saturday evening slot. It was during prime time. It was aired at 7:30 on Saturday evening. They looked forward to the Awareness Show and JP Neal and Jacquelyn Johnson. My mother would not have me called Jackie Johnson. She said, your name is Jacquelyn. Jacquelyn, yes. So make them call you Jacquelyn.
Right.
And I enjoyed every minute of it.
Very fulfilling experience for you, I'm sure.
Oh, very much so.
And Carolyn, the same for you. What was the value of Awareness for you?
It was interesting because, you know, as most of these folks here know, I'm a little bit of a change agent. So I kind of came into an institution. I was trying to shake it up and do some new things, kind of like you're doing. But we did a lot of stuff outside of the studio as well. And that was new to people. And so we wanted to kind of take the show to places and do things that we hadn't necessarily done or you couldn't do if you were in studio. So I think that was a little bit, you know, I had to marry that with what had traditionally been a format where people came into the studio. But we had a great time, a really good time. A really great chance to dive into, you know, who had the new book that was out, the new movie that was out, and it really became kind of the place to be in terms of getting your information out to the public. So it was a great time. Right.
And Judi, it's so nice because you can cover an array of topics. You're not pigeonholed into one particular category. And even though it does have an African-American audience, I think the topics still, they relate to everybody.
They do, I think, and I always credit Carolyn with this because when I moved to Columbia almost 20 years ago, she was the only face on television that I saw that looked like me, that gave me the opportunity to think, well, maybe I could do that. And when I came in, you know, we talk so much about, especially in our culture, we kind of have that got mine mentality, and she was so warm and so welcoming and inviting, and it always makes me cry to even think about it. But she paved the way. She really did. And I thought that Awareness was always a wonderful platform to elevate the conversation. Because on the newscast, as you ladies know, and Jacquelyn, you see it every night, you know, when you put on a production, people have to talk in sound bites to talk about really complicated issues. But on Awareness, you can really dive into it, elevate the conversation, give it that important context and perspective to be able to help us as a community and a society to really move forward in a constructive way.
You are too kind. I have to, but I have to also point out that Awareness was a great opportunity for people who perhaps couldn't get on the air immediately in that newsroom, but wanted an opportunity to work around television. And I can remember when Miss Judi came here to WIS and was in radio. You have to think back, but she was in radio, and just offered to come and support what we were trying to do with the Awareness Show, which was huge. And young people who are listening should know that's how you get into this business, and that's how you become the lead anchor at the TV station, okay? You jump in there and get as much experience as you can and learn as much as you possibly can.
Absolutely. So. And Jacquelyn, going back to your tenure when you were co-hosting, where do you want to see Awareness in the future? How do you want to see it move forward?
I want to see Awareness move forward pretty much the way we did things back in the 70s, things that weren't covered in the newsroom. We would cover them on Awareness. For example, the closing of Booker T. Washington High School. When they wouldn't cover it in the newsroom, we had a whole segment on that closing of Booker T. Washington High School on Awareness. We had people from Booker T. Washington, we had pictures, and we made it important on the Awareness Show. So things that aren't important in a mainstream newsroom, we would like to see made important on awareness for the community.
Still a relevant show in the 70s and the 80s, 90s, and still today.
Oh, yes.
And we have about 30 seconds left, but if you could quickly say, what do you want to see for the future of awareness?
I would like for this community to really embrace it even further. And, you know, being a little bit more on the advocacy side these days, this is the time for you to share your special awareness memory and what it did to maybe change your life, because we all know those kinds of things have impact. But it's, you know, I've seen markets, when I left here and I worked in Boston, that public affairs show went from an hour to a half hour to 15 minutes by the time I left. And so if you don't take and love and appreciate and acknowledge something, it isn't always there. And so I encourage the public to do that.
Well, ladies, thank you so much for being with us. I really appreciate this. I wish we had much more time.
I know.
Thank you for continuing to do a great job, Megan.
The
great
wonderful job you do every day.
Very proud.
Well, stay with us. When we come back, a final thought. It is said you can't know where you're going until you know where you've been. While awareness evolves over the years, its mission remains true. Each week, we seek to educate, inspire, and activate a self-awareness of what's going on around us. This awareness history is not just African American history. It is part of a legacy we all share. I hope you continue to participate in our growth. Today is just part one of our anniversary special. Next week, you'll hear from more former hosts and the show's first executive producer who helped to create awareness, Mr. Isaac Washington.
I know that awareness probably played a big part in the overall evolution of this WIS. Well, I want awareness to continue to be that catalyst that bridges the gap between races.
We'd like to thank all of our guests this morning. Until next time, I'm Megan Norman. This is Awareness.